Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of us who are joining from the other side of the Atlantic. Welcome to this EPC online discussion, which today is looking at Turkey's local elections, key takeaways. I'm joined today by two special guests, by Berk Esen, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Sabancı University in Istanbul, and by Demir Murat Seyrek, Senior Advisor, European Foundation for Democracy and Adjunct Professor at the Brussels School of Governance here in Belgium. Welcome to both of you. I think that we can all agree that the evening of March 31st was a good evening. We saw a very special outcome to the elections, almost a landslide, in fact, for the opposition, something that wasn't expected. Nobody really predicted it, as far as I'm aware. Maybe I don't know everybody's perspectives, but that's what it looked like to me. So we're here now to have a sort of deep dive into the elections, look at why this happened, what was behind it, what can we expect next, what are the big challenges, what are the main opportunities coming up. I mean, there's no more elections in Turkey now until the next presidential and parliamentary elections, which I think are 4 years away. So there's a lot of time, and a lot of things can happen in that time. So I'm going to have a bit of a conversation with our guests today before we will take Q&A from the audience. So I want to start with a general question to both of you. According to the results, the opposition, I mean the main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, CHP, is now the largest party. I mean, they were very successful. What did the CHP do right this time that they hadn't done that well in the past? Or what was it that the AKP failed to do? So maybe start with you, Berk, and then come to Murat. You need to unmute.
Yes. Well, let me first of all begin by thanking Amanda for putting together this timely panel. Of course, the 2024 local elections produced a political earthquake, nothing like what we've seen so far over the last 20 years. And this is really the biggest election defeat of President Erdogan's entire political career. We saw the main opposition party for the first time surpass the vote share of AKP to become the largest party in the country, and picking up several provincial municipal governments across Turkey. In fact, in some regions where historically CHP has not necessarily done well, there are some provinces like Afyon, Kütahya, Balıkesir, where the CHP won quite possibly for the first time at the local level since local elections were held since 1950, right? So it's really a historic win. And I think in order to really make sense of these surprising results, we need to look at what the AKP has not done, as well as what this main opposition CHP did right this time. Maybe the first point that I can raise is the nature of the local elections, because of course the nature of local elections differ from general elections. The stakes are much lower. In the local elections, you don't necessarily get to vote for who's going to lead the country, but rather you can focus on individual provinces or districts. So I think it was a lot easier for political parties to coordinate among one another in terms of picking candidates. But I think it was also because the stakes were much lower, several, I think quite a high number of pro-government voters could decide to vote for alternatives as opposed to go for Erdogan, as they have done in the previous elections. So in terms of what the CHP did right, well, first of all, I need to mention the leadership change that occurred after the 2023 general elections. Kılıçdaroğlu the former CHP leader, who ended up becoming the joint candidate of the opposition alliance, of course, failed to win these elections. And in the aftermath of this election defeat, I think his defeat demoralized opposition voters, particularly CHP voters. So the fact that CHP could have a leadership change through normal, regular democratic channels really did energize the party base, and that persuaded CHP voters to go out and vote for their party again after this disappointing election defeat last year. I think the CHP mayors, especially those who run major metropolitan areas such as Istanbul, Ankara, but also Adana, Mersin, Eskişehir, and several other major cities, had incumbency advantage. They have already been running their cities at least since 2019, and some of these figures have been running those provinces even for a longer period. So I think many voters really warmed up to the idea of CHP rule. Were happy with the local management of these mayors, particularly against the backdrop of an economic downturn, as well as the poor management of the government during the pandemic. So that really worked in the favor of CHP, where especially in major metropolitan areas, quite possibly since the 2017 referendum, CHP and the opposition vote tends to be larger than the pro-government vote. And this being local elections, I think that advantage could materialize at the voting booth. Candidates matter. I think following the CHP's leadership change, the main opposition party could nominate a young generation of candidates, especially in major metropolitan areas, some of whom came from the local ranks of the party, who had high level of popularity and support within their respective regions, districts or provinces. There were a number of young CHP MPs who decided to run as mayoral candidates, and because they had recognition in their provinces, they could actually achieve positive results, and many of them won the local elections. And I think the disintegration of the opposition alliance in the aftermath of the 2023 elections ended up favoring the CHP rather than hurting the main opposition party, because prior to the elections, I think many opposition voters were worried that because opposition parties were nominating candidates of their own within each province and in most of the districts across the country, that would fragment the opposition vote and the ruling alliance would win. But what we saw was the other way around. Because of the fact that the opposition alliance disintegrated, CHP gained the flexibility to nominate candidates from different political backgrounds, depending on the particular electorate in that province. So in those areas where Kurdish voters had quite a sizable minority, CHP could go with pro-Kurdish candidates or candidates who were more lenient towards the Kurdish question. In other areas, CHP could go with more nationalist-minded politicians who could court nationalist politicians. In other provinces, it could go with ideologically moderate candidates. Because there was no alliance, and that the CHP leadership did not necessarily need to negotiate, particularly with any of the other opposition parties, it ended up, I think, picking candidates that really reflected the electorate within those areas. And that also played a role behind CHP's success. That, of course, in addition to several things that the AKP did not do, but those are the things that I think the main opposition party did quite well.
Thank you, Berk, for these insights. I would like to see if Murat more or less agrees with you. Or, I mean, for example, Murat, I mean, when we talk about the economic situation in Turkey, I mean, it's been pretty bad for a prolonged period of time now, despite the efforts of President Erdogan and the ruling AKP to actually improve it. I mean, it's almost as expensive to live in Turkey now as it is to live here. To what degree do you think the bad economic climate and social situation in the country really played a role here. I mean, obviously, this is also not the first time we've seen the opposition be victorious in local elections. I mean, they were quite victorious last time as well, not to the degree of this time. But to which degree is the economic factor important here?
Of course, it's important, but we need to recognize one fact that it is also success of CHP. So I totally agree. And we should understand that these are very actually unfavorable conditions, very unjust conditions for elections. And despite those, the CHP could succeed. And there are also other disadvantages because many opposition voters actually were extremely unmotivated and they were even deeply disappointed in 2023. So last year people were hopeful, but not necessarily this year before the election. So considering all these conditions, we need to give it to the CHP that I think it is a rather important victory. And just to say it maybe the same thing from a different way, I think CHP managed to form an alliance with the opposition voters because in a way there was no electoral alliance, but CHP made it clear that those candidates, CHP's candidates, were the ones with a chance to get elected so that all opposition voters somehow voted for them, at least a big majority of them. So this was the main point behind the success. But as you say, of course, there are also problems connected to AKP. I mean, actually, AKP is really facing with several challenges at the moment. Some of them are new, some of them are not really new, and many of them are actually very difficult to solve, and one of them being the economy. So Erdogan's main promise in the last presidential campaign was to improve the economy. So he also changed certain things. He abandoned his unorthodox economic policies. There are definitely more qualified people in the economic team at the moment. But the main problem with the economy in Turkey is not really about economy. It's all about politics. It's about rule of law. It's about improving Turkey's image abroad. You cannot really change that by just implementing the right economic policies. I think in a way, the improvement of the Turkish economy is actually relatively easy because we are not really talking about structural problems. The banking system is relatively good. It's also thanks to the reforms by Kemal Dervish before AKP. We still have in Turkey a production-based economy, and despite everything, the private sector is still strong. And on top of that, I think global developments are also in Turkey's favor. In fact, everything is ideal except the political atmosphere, the climate. With the right climate, the Turkish economy actually has the potential to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world again, but this is also very difficult for the AKP to achieve. The formula is clear: more democracy, more predictability, rule of law, transparency, meritocracy rather than cronyism. This formula is simple, but it is almost impossible for the current government to implement this formula, to go back to democracy, to democratization, and strengthening democratic institutions in the country. I think that is the main challenge.
But in this case, what does that actually mean for the future? I mean, of the AKP, because the way that you frame it, it sounds as if they continue down this road, I mean, that's basically the end of their rule in the country. I mean, a few years down the road. Is that something that you would foresee? Or is there a way that they can actually regain support? I mean, there's large parts of Turkey that apparently don't have that much interest in the rule of law. I mean, we've seen that for many years. So perhaps those are the parts that, you know, voted differently this time, but again, in a presidential national election, they will revert. So what would you expect to be actually now the main priority of President Erdogan and the ruling AKP? And also maybe touch on the issue of the comments that President Erdogan actually made a few weeks ago about him not running in another election. Shall we take that with a pinch of salt? Or is he really serious about, you know, getting his pipe and slippers and retiring?
Well, it's certainly very early to claim that that's the end of the AKP, that's clear. And I agree that in terms of rule of law and certain fundamental rights and freedoms may be a part of society, they don't really care that much about them, but they do care about the consequences of them, because actually the economic crisis we are facing with at the moment is directly consequence of this political climate. I mean, maybe they may not care about the rule of law, but the consequence of rule of law or the lack of rule of law has major effects on economy. So that's the problem, and that's also why people are changing their votes at the moment. So what the AKP can do, I mean, and the expectation is also after this Bayram holiday that the President Erdogan may come up with some actually changes. So there can be some changes within the government, but more than that, he may also suggest some other changes even within the system. So actually he was looking for new constitutional changes as well, actually a complete new constitution. But after this results, of course, such an attempt would also require very close dialogue with the opposition and at least support of some of the opposition parties. So this is going to be, of course, rather challenging. But we need to understand that actually AKP is also a victim of its own presidential system. So in a way, all these electoral alliances have become important as a result of this system, because at least for the presidential, you need more than 50%. And first it started with the nationalist MHP, so AKP has become more dependent on the party. And this is really limiting even today what the AKP can do in domestic and foreign policy. And then MHP was not enough either. So in the last elections, we saw a number of other parties join the alliance, but it's also very difficult to manage this alliance and expectations of different political parties. I mean, just an example, this small Islamist party, YRP, is an example. I mean, AKP couldn't convince them to join again in these elections, for example, because it was difficult to, in a way, go with their expectations and preconditions. So in a way, AKP is losing power, and while losing power, they need new alliances, but this also makes the AKP's task more and more difficult in every election. I mean, the AKP has been winning elections, but by losing power. That's something we don't really understand and discuss in the West, but it is the case. Of course, this new constitution idea may come up, and then there can be even some suggestions to change the presidential system, or at least modify it. But then, even then, Erdogan will need to convince, first of all, the electoral alliance and sort of partner and the coalition partner, sort of MHP, but at the same time, will need some other support. So that's going to be very difficult. And I think another challenge is the one strong man phenomena. I mean, there are advantages of this, but we also see in these elections that it creates a lot of trouble, because there are no other strong figures in the party. So while even looking for candidates for the municipal elections, that was really difficult to find strong, charismatic candidates for the AKP. So as for the next elections, of course, it's very difficult to know from now. I mean, he may still try one more time by finding different ways, including changing the constitution or snap elections. But it is also challenging, I mean, to see if he can be reelected, if he will be convinced that he can be reelected, or if he decides to get retired, who will replace him? Because that's also the last challenge I wanted to touch upon. It is one of the main challenges of Erdogan, I think, to prepare the party for the post-Erdogan era. I mean, his popularity is certainly higher than the AKP's, and he can keep the party together, but we cannot really see any other personalities who can do that. I mean, there are rumors about some names, but that's really a huge challenge. I mean, that's also linked to the one-man system, because he's the one he's the strong man, he's controlling the party, but no one else can realistically do this at this level.
Thanks, Murat. I want to stick with this topic just for a few minutes more and turn back to you, Berk, because, I mean, on the evening of the elections, I mean, President Erdogan acted quite humbly. We saw him acknowledging that the AKP / himself, I'm guessing, had made many mistakes and that they would strive to correct or change some policies. I mean, in your opinion, I mean, do you agree with the points that Murat made, or do you see other areas where he will also try to evolve policies or change in order to sort of win back support? And a second question: how do you see the future of the relationship between President Erdogan, the AKP, and the Nationalist Party and Mr. Bachelet? I mean, they seem to have a sort of love-hate relationship at many times. I mean, one minute they're very close allies, and then they're not. So how sustainable do you see this?
Thank you, Amanda. I mean, those are two very critical questions whose answers will determine the trajectory of Turkey's political regime. As Murat Bey also mentioned, Turkish politics has become quite authoritarian over the past decade, and the playing field is tilted in favor of the ruling alliance. And I think both the AKP and the ultranationalist MHP have benefited from this ongoing alliance, such that I see it as a symbiotic relationship. Yes, both parties seem to disagree on certain policy issues. AKP does not necessarily have a ultranationalist background, and actually has over the past decade successfully courted conservative Kurdish voters. So allying itself with MHP has cost the AKP some votes, especially in the eastern and southeastern part of the country, where Kurdish voters are rather more prevalent. But at the same time, going together with MHP has allowed Erdogan to retain around a 50-51% majority, so that he keeps on winning elections. MHP officials ended up staffing the state bureaucracy, especially in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt in 2016, when Erdogan really needed human capital, like manpower to, officials to take over the state apparatus as he was purging, especially members of the Gülen movement. So I'm not so sure if this alliance will fall through anytime soon, because Erdogan may not necessarily have any other ally that can make up for MHP's vacuum. But clearly, looking at the election results, we need to see the success enjoyed not only by the main opposition party, but by this minor Islamist party that is on the rise, the New Welfare Party. And so Erdogan will probably try to put together a more comprehensive electoral alliance going forward, and that will require retaining MHP in the alliance, but also making appeals to conservative parties, starting with the New Welfare Party, which got over 6% of the vote share in the recent local elections, but also maybe courting conservative MPs from these other minor parties that are now represented in the parliament, such as Deva Party, Gelecek Party, and Felicity Party. But maybe also Erdogan will try to court some Good Party MPs. Good Party was part of the opposition alliance, but after the election defeat in 2023, started following a more autonomous path. So Erdogan certainly has other allies that he can work with, but I think they're going to be complementary rather than supplementary to the support that MHP gives to Erdogan. But of course, Erdogan faces a major dilemma, and I think the regime is coming to a crossroads. So electoral authoritarian regimes such as Turkey, whenever they experience the opposition parties become more competitive, have to figure out a way to either compete with those opposition parties on equal terms. But I think after 20 years of Erdogan rule, with the ongoing economic downturn, cracks in the ruling coalition, that is not an easy feat. Or the regime turns more authoritarian. So that the opposition is weakened, not necessarily in the electoral arena, but through extra constitutional means. Or the regime collapses in a gradual manner as a result of government turnover through elections. So I think we're looking at these three scenarios. Now, Erdogan has repeatedly said after the election, as you mentioned, he recognized the results. His party has challenged election results in some isolated cases, for instance, in Van and in some other districts and provinces where the AKP candidates lost by a very small margin. But otherwise, across the country, especially in major metropolitan areas, it seems that Erdogan has recognized the results, and the AKP is not necessarily going to do anything to challenge them. He repeatedly said that for the next 4 years, there will not be any other election, and that his government is going to focus on governing the country and managing the economy. And I think that's his plan, right? So for the next 4 years, he will try to implement some orthodox measures in order to preserve macroeconomic stability, so that he can lower the inflation rate, bring some stability to the country, so that Turkey can once again attract foreign investment, and that will fuel economic growth sizable enough for Erdogan to once again get support from these conservative swing voters, especially living in major cities, that are now looking for other options, be it CHP or this minor Islamist party. I think at the same time, Erdogan will try to adopt even a more conservative cultural message to consolidate his base. And of course, that would require him to take a more tough stance on the Palestinian question, the current Gaza crisis, maybe implement some constitutional changes to push for an anti-LGBT legislation, emphasize strong family, and any other conservative issue, conservative religious issue that will play well with not only the AKP base, but also now with these pious voters who are switching their support to the new welfare party, right? So fixing the economy and consolidating the conservative base, so that Erdogan may once again win the presidential elections. Those are not necessarily easy to do. Because maybe I can very quickly share a political map, just for a couple of minutes to show you the sheer size of the opposition victory and how difficult it will be for Erdogan to really reverse this going forward. This is basically Turkey's political map, looking at the 2024 local elections. Now, CHP has historically done well in Turkey's economically developed secular coastal provinces, such as Mersin, Antalya, Izmir, Çanakkale, Muğla, and Aydın. But first in the 2019 local elections, but especially in this election, we have witnessed CHP candidates win surprising victories, even in central parts of the country, sort of breaking into the AKP's firewall. Such that in this election, so this is how the electoral map looked in 2019. As you can see, CHP won in Istanbul and Ankara and Eskişehir, Bolu, and so on in 2019. So already started picking up some provinces in central parts of Anatolia. But in 2024, the main opposition victory is quite dramatic, such that the entire Aegean region is going to be controlled by the CHP. So Erdogan already faces a very strong challenge from the main opposition party, and not only from a single figure such as Ekrem İmamoğlu, who was the focus of opposition talk in the lead up to the election, but also from Mansur Yavaş, also from several other very popular mayors. So Erdogan will really need to go after every single one of them in order to weaken the main opposition party, and that's a very difficult task. the CHP currently controls more than 50% of the electorate in terms of the provincial municipalities it controls. But in addition to that strong opposition coming from CHP, AKP started losing votes to new welfare parties, such that, for instance, in Urfa and Yozgat, as you can see with the gray color, this party began to really break Erdogan's very powerful popular base, whom he cobbled together through a policy of polarization for the last 20 years, and we're now seeing additional competitors. And so dealing with both of these challenges at a time of an economic downturn, when clearly Turkey's political system is broken because the current hyper-presidential system is no longer really working, and Erdogan is experiencing difficulty finding not only charismatic candidates at the local level, but also competent officials to govern the country, this is going to be a rather difficult task.
Thank you, Berk. I mean, you make it sound like President Erdogan and the AKP have major challenges, and it's very questionable whether they'll be able to actually rise to these challenges. But I mean, from previous experience, I mean, we know that even in the darkest of the darkest scenarios, Erdogan has an ability to pull something out of the hat. Let's say when he's down and you may think that he's on his way out. So I'm interested to hear from you, Murat, next. I mean, does the opposition have a strategy? Because, I mean, everything's good now. Everything looks rosy, but is this sustainable? Are they able to put together a real strategy for the run-up? I mean, it's 4 years away, of course, but to maintain this sort of level of support, to build on it, and to be able to push back the potential efforts by the AKP, by President Erdogan, to actually, let's say, I wouldn't like to say rise from the ashes, or something similar to that. I mean, do they have a strategy? And what about some of the prospects for some of the other opposition parties? For example, the E Party. I mean, we've seen Meral Akşener really perform badly to the point where she's had to resign. I mean, what is the future of the E Party, or is it going to basically disappear from the spectrum? Just to the audience, please do put your questions and I'll start to take them in a second.
Well, when we talk about opposition, I think our focus will need to be CHP. I mean, this success in the elections also created a lot of responsibility for the party. Now the party should not be only a center-left party anymore, because it has been receiving actually votes from all different political spectrums. So, and the main common point of all these voters is clear. They are against the AKP. So this is, of course, a strong motivation. But if CHP wants to remain the largest party and keep these voters or get even stronger, it will have to be very careful about the strategies in the coming period. And I mean, the party has become more and more inclusive in any case, but more efforts may still be needed. In addition, the CHP mayors will need to deliver. They need to be successful. I mean, the success of the mayors in Ankara and Istanbul, they played a major role actually in this success. But now there is a bigger responsibility. The party is successful almost all over Turkey, so that they need to show that they can actually rule, they can deliver results, and under rather unfavorable conditions too, because it's also not very easy to be an opposition mayor in Turkey. You are dealing with many problems in terms of financing your projects. You're dealing with many legal challenges and other issues. So this is, of course, a challenge. So it really depends to what extent CHP will be able to use this opportunity. As to the other parties, I mean, maybe we can go through the parties actually of this famous or infamous table of 6 from last year. Most of them, they seem to be disappearing. And we also understand in a way their actual power, because especially the failure of 2 parties, Babacan's DEVA and Davutoğlu's Gelecek Party, it's in a way clear indication of the fact that political engineering is not really working well. So you may be a popular minister, You can even be very strong in a government, but it doesn't mean that you can just set up a political party and be successful. I think that was the major mistake of the previous chair of the CHP, Kılıçdaroğlu. He really thought that through these parties, he can attract actually AKP's voters. But it didn't happen in 2023 elections. Actually, within this table of 6, apart from the CHP, the only party with a lot of potential was the Good Party and Meral Akşener. And I think in a way, it is also the victim of mismanagement and bad strategies. So this is in a way also unfortunate, because a well-managed Good Party could also be very well in the central rights, and they could play a very active role in this process. But they seem to be in a lot of trouble. As you said, Meral Akşener has already resigned. There's going to be a party congress. It's not very clear whether they can really come up with a new plan, new strategy, and then regain those voters. I mean, many disappointed Good Party voters actually voted for CHP, and they played a major role in this election success. But this also shows that their voters, they are more actually anti-AKP than pro-Good Party. So they don't really have this sort of identity to the party, but they are all coming around one particular cause. They would like to change the government. So that's why if they see that CHP continues to be strong and successful with the new mayors, we may see more and more actually Good Party voters and even some senior figures from the party joining the CHP.
Thanks, Murat. And I want to stay on the issue of the CHP, because there's a question in the chat box addressed to you, Berk, from Adjunct Uysal, who's asking the way forward of the CHP. How do you expect the CHP to reshape its alliance strategy, especially after the elections, while feeling the intense vacuum at the center-right?
Let me actually combine your question and Adjunct Uysal's question, because they, I think, speak to the same issue. So looking at the election results, my conclusion is that this is no longer Erdogan's election to win going forward, but rather the main oppositions to lose. So Erdogan has experienced electoral declines on several occasions in previous years. I can, for instance, mention the 2009 local election, when the AKP's vote share declined by 10%. The June 2015 elections, again, when AKP's vote share declined by almost 8 or 9%, and AKP lost its parliamentary majority for the first time. And then, of course, 2019 local elections, when AKP's vote share declined a bit, but that the opposition, by coming together and nominating joint candidates, could defeat the pro-government candidates in most major metropolitan areas. Now, after these 3 election defeats, Erdogan really managed to bounce back, but basically following more or less the same policy agenda or the same set of strategies. He tried to fragment the opposition. He co-opted his popular rivals in the right side of the political spectrum, and he repressed the pro-Kurdish movement. So I think in terms of really seeing what Erdogan may do in the near future, and what CHP can do to counter that, we need to focus on these three strategies. Now, the opposition alliance had already disintegrated going into the 2024 local elections, and yet the CHP managed to consolidate not only its own base, but almost the entire opposition camp. Because in most provinces, especially major metropolitan areas, but also even in many other Anatolian provinces, opposition voters who did not want to see the ruling party succeed at the polls ended up voting for CHP, and that allowed CHP to transform itself into a catch-all party. And I think that should be its strategy going forward, to sort of directly appeal almost to the entire opposition camp through ideologically moderate messages, so not necessarily go for the extreme end, either extreme sort of Kemalist messages or extreme left messages, but rather, occupy the political center, maybe the center right as well as the center left, because I'm not so sure when and if EU party will be able to bounce back from its election defeat. And I'm not so sure if the pro-Kurdish movement will be able to moderate its discourse in such a way that it can be officially part of an opposition alliance in the next presidential election. So probably the CHP candidate, whoever he or she will be, will need to cobble together a coalition at the voter level rather than at the elite level. And you can only do it by moderating your ideological discourse. And I think that's one thing that CHP needs to do. Also, CHP, and I agree with Murat Bey's analysis, CHP mayors need to deliver. In these kind of electoral authoritarian regimes, local elections matter, because if the opposition parties win a municipal government, then they can actually offer public services, distribute resources in order to reach out to even the pro-government voters. So you get this empowerment effect that will come out of the local elections, because CHP mayors across different parts of the country will be able to directly appeal to voters, reach out to them through municipal services, and many of these mayors will have name recognition, which is really an invaluable resource in an increasingly authoritarian context, where much of the national media is controlled by the incumbent. The state resources are used in a partisan way for the ruling party to win elections, and the opposition parties are deprived of such resources and face really the pressure of the state apparatus. But now, through local government, CHP can actually balance against these unfair advantages that are given to the ruling party. So as long as they can deliver, I think they will be able to put together a sizable electoral coalition. They really need to transform themselves from a locally effective party, which I think CHP was in many of these major metropolitan areas, to a national party with a clear economic agenda, with a clear foreign policy agenda, so that CHP will be able to give a credible message to the voters that it can replace the AKP, because the stake, as I already mentioned in the first round, the stakes are much lower in local elections than national elections. And in order to win the national elections, CHP really needs to convey to the voters that it can deliver, not only at the local level, but also at the national level. It is not clear to me what CHP's foreign policy agenda was under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. It was not clear to me who will run the Turkish economy if the Nation Alliance were to win the 2023 elections. It was not clear to me if CHP could have really staffed the state bureaucracy if it were to win the presidential elections. So the party now has at least several more years during which it can deliver, it can moderate its message and come to the center to cobble together a large electoral coalition, and it can also recruit better candidates and train officials who will be able to govern the country. And I think 3 or 4 years is a long enough time for CHP to do it. The reason why I was rather making a pessimistic analysis for President Erdogan was that I think through normal legal means, it is going to be very difficult for him to reverse this trend. Of course, as the leader of an electoral authoritarian regime, he has other extra constitutional instruments at his disposal to reverse this outcome, but that would mean pushing Turkey in an even more authoritarian direction. And I'm still skeptical as to whether or not he has the capacity to do that.
Thank you, Berk. This is all super interesting. I'm aware of the time, and I want to get some of these questions in. So I'm going to ask both of you if you can be a bit shorter in your responses. I mean, it's very interesting, but we don't have all night to be here. So I want to start with this issue, and maybe put this to you, Murat, the issue of polarization, because it seems that there was a reduction in polarization between the secular and conservative voters. I mean, those that voted for the opposition. I mean, is this sustainable? How can they maintain this in the future? going ahead? Because it's obviously really important, because we've seen it, this polarization issue has been very divisive within Turkish society. So how can they capitalize on this, and are they able to actually do this going ahead?
Well, I think, again, it will depend on the success of the mayors. And I mean, to a certain extent, both İmamoğlu Istanbul mayor and Yavaş Ankara mayor, they've been doing this. I mean, they've been using a very soft language. They were trying to reach out to people also voting for the AKP. And they managed this to a certain extent in Istanbul and in Ankara, because in a way, I think people are also really tired of this entire polarization in the country. They would like to see some results rather than all this tension, and they just would like to have a better life. I mean, people don't expect a lot in a way. They just want to have a better economy, better life. So, and in a way, this increased polarization is not bringing that. So I think that is the key factor, actually, the CHP should be working on in the next 4 years until the elections, showing that the party is inclusive, and the services, especially at the municipal level, will be provided to all citizens without really checking their political identity, affiliation. So this will be really the key. And doing this in Istanbul and in Ankara to a certain extent, we saw that it really changes the dynamics. And if CHP can do that all around Turkey, I believe that it will be very difficult to challenge this.
Thank you, Murat. I want to put the next question to you, Berk. It's from Aisha Yürekli, and she's basically saying that women were also big winners in these elections, because they nearly tripled the number of female mayors, 11 out of 81 provinces, which is a major achievement. How do you read this? I mean, she's asking, can it be considered a call for gender equality? Do we finally hear the footsteps of women in Turkish politics?
I mean, this is definitely a call for more gender equality, and unfortunately, Turkish politics has really a very poor track record when it comes to including women candidates. And so far, especially at the local level, historically speaking, we haven't necessarily seen a lot of female mayors who run their cities at the provincial level. First, the pro-Kurdish movement started changing that by having a dual candidate system, whereby they put forward an official candidate, but this candidate is joined by a candidate from the opposite gender. And I think this policy has really worked out in practical terms quite well. And the pro-Kurdish party, both at the local level, but more importantly, in the general elections at the parliamentary level, ended up really increasing women candidates. CHP has done a much better job this time around. I think they had a dismal performance in the previous elections. This is a center-left secular party, and you would have expected CHP to really focus more on women candidates, but they haven't necessarily done this until this election. But as Aisha rightly points out, both at the general level, but specifically CHP ended up recruiting some female mayoral candidates, many of whom went on to win the election. So this is certainly a positive change. And I think we're now seeing also the impact of demographic change, because the median age in Turkey, if I remember correctly, is 32. So quite a high portion of the electorate consists of young voters. And female voters are a lot more involved, a lot more educated than the older generation voters, and that creates pressure. I see more female politicians working for these parties. So certainly, there is a call for gender equality, and we're now seeing some positive changes. And it will be interesting. I would probably point out Istanbul more so than some of the other major metropolitan areas in terms of really bringing about that change. First, within the city administration, and now at the district level, we have some very prominent female candidates who won elections. I can single out, for instance, Üsküdar, which is a very sizable district in the Asian side of Istanbul. Used to be a very conservative area, but had changed a bit over the years to become a swing district. And CHP nominated an Istanbul Greater Municipality official, a female candidate who won by a large margin. And I think this is the way forward for the main opposition party.
Thank you, Berk. I'm going to come back to you, Murat, now. We have a question here from Andrew Duff, who's asking about the media. How did the media perform in the elections? And does the result help to liberalize the climate of political debate in the future?
Well, they didn't do very well because also, as it was mentioned, media is not really free, and then most of the actually mainstream media is controlled by pro-AKP businesses. So we cannot really talk about total free debate in those TVs or connected newspapers. On the other hand, I think Turkey is showing another reality to the world, that the new media can actually work, because in a way, even if it's still quite limited, the entire opposition media is running through the main part is running through the online media. The YouTube channels are extremely popular. I mean, even the election night, one of those channels by a journalist who left one of the actually main TVs recently, he was the one most watched. I mean, 6.7 million people follow the elections on YouTube through his channel. So this already tells a lot, I guess. And then also there are some pro-opposition TV channels as well. But then again, the problem is probably the question of polarization, because normally in a healthy democratic country, we shouldn't talk about really pro-government and pro-opposition media. We should talk about free media, independent media. And that's becoming a challenge, of course, as the majority of the mainstream is controlled by the pro-government forces. In a way, it pushes other journalists or other initiatives in a way to be pro-opposition. So this should be also changed in the meantime. But I still believe that in terms of new media, Turkey is really a major example, even for some other countries to examine and to see how it works and how it can be used actually by the political parties as well.
Thank you, Murat. We only have a few minutes left, and I don't want to leave this webinar without touching on the EU and the US. I mean, particularly because EPC is based in Brussels. So I would put the same question to both of you. How do you think the EU and the US should respond to this election result? I mean, what should their approach be now? Maybe start with you, Berk, and then come to Murat.
I mean, Erdogan is an authoritarian populist leader. And we've seen leaders of this profile, so not just Erdogan, but also figures like Vučić, Orban, hedge their bets in the international arena, especially over the last decade. These leaders try to negotiate with both the Western governments as well as Russia, and also to a certain extent China, to get better deals from both sides. And they actually try to put off these sides against one another in order to gain more resources, benefits, concessions for their regime, so that they can consolidate power in the domestic front and stay in office for longer. And that's a strategy that Erdogan used very effectively. He used the migration crisis as a leverage to negotiate a better deal with the European Union. He used the Russo-Ukrainian war to get concessions from the West. But I think we're going to see him try to sort of reduce his more confrontational rhetoric vis-a-vis the West, because I don't think that he has as many cards up his sleeve as he used to have. The election results were a clear defeat for him, so he'll try to appease the West to a large extent, maybe try to get another migration deal of some sort from the EU. He is going to visit the US and have a one-to-one meeting with Joe Biden, I think in early May. So I expect him to sort of lean in that direction. I think what the Western governments need to do is to not necessarily cave into an authoritarian populist leader, in the hopes of getting concessions for that can work for the short term. Clearly, the opposition in this country is on the rise. If it can get, if it can really deliver at the local level, we may possibly see a government turnover in the next presidential elections. That is not necessarily an unrealistic scenario. So probably Western governments, Western institutions should also try to deal with the main opposition party, incorporate it into its channels, maybe offer some resources, grants, funds to the CHP-run municipal government so that they can balance the tilted playing field. Turkey is not Erdogan. Erdogan is not the only political leader who is going to dominate Turkish politics going forward. And I think it's really important to really keep the pressure on Erdogan so that he cannot turn more authoritarian in order to survive in office. That's the dangerous scenario that, for instance, we've seen in Venezuela in 2010s, when the Maduro government became really unpopular with the voters. He turned more authoritarian and somehow survived. We need to make sure that that scenario does not materialize in the Turkish context. And then we are, I think, approaching the beginning of the end for Erdogan's government.
Thank you, Berk. Do you agree with that, Murat?
Yes, and I will probably better focus on the EU side and what the EU can do. And actually, at a time when many EU member states are struggling with extremism, the rise of far-right, far-left political parties, despite ideal conditions for democracy, I think such a victory for Democrats in Turkey, despite unfavorable conditions, to say the least, must be seen as a very good news for Europe, but also for the future of Europe. I mean, EU has always been wondering how to better engage with Democrats in the country, and the local elections are giving a big gift to the EU if the EU is really sincere about supporting democracy and Democrats in the country. I mean, now the majority of Turkish cities are run by the CHP. The cities with CHP mayors represent 62% of the population. And I don't even include the cities with mayors from the, for example, pro-Kurdish Dem, then the figures will be even higher. So considering the fact that local authorities can play a role in democratization, I think they should really be supported by the EU. That can also be an excellent channel to reestablish dialogue with Turkey, with Turkish Democrats, with people in the country. As Berk mentioned also, I mean, municipalities are also struggling usually for the loans for financing certain projects as well, especially major infrastructure projects in Turkey. So the EU and certain institutions such as the European Investment Bank actually can play an active role in this regard. It is also possible to look for alternative ways to establish cooperation with the municipalities, with the mayors, make them also more visible, but also bringing them more to Europe to establish better dialogue with them as well. I mean, it is very likely that one of these mayors will be ruling the country actually in the future. Probably İmamoğlu is the number one in that sense, but Ankara mayor has also a chance in that sense as well, or at least they will be all around in one government at some point in the future. So I think one point is very clear: Democrats in Turkey have achieved such a victory, not thanks to the EU, but despite the EU's totally passive approach with no strategy, no vision, no plans for Turkey or Turkey-EU relations whatsoever. So Turkey's democratic resilience, I think, is an important case, and the EU should really appreciate this. I mean, there are positive signals that are coming from the EU, but the EU still lacks a real strategy. So in a way, we need to see it from a different perspective as well. It's not really only about Turkey-EU relations, but it's also about the future of Europe as well. I mean, the world is changing fast. Russia is really an existential threat at the moment for Europe. Countries like Russia, China, Iran, they create major risks for the future of Europe. So in these circumstances, I think a democratic Turkey or a vision for a democratic Turkey in the future, that's really an opportunity for Europe. So it's an opportunity to be invested in. And in a way, this current transactional status is not bringing real potential of Turkey-EU relations. I mean, it is really far from here. I mean, we can really achieve a lot by establishing real cooperation, strategic cooperation between Turkey and the EU based on values, democracy, and fundamental rights as well. And any action before this happens, actually, because I believe that sooner or later the change is coming in the country, and any actions such as ending, for example, the accession process would be a very short-sighted perspective. So, and while waiting for that moment, I think further dialogue and cooperation should be established with mayors and municipalities. That's the perfect opportunity. But we need to really see now the EU taking some initiatives as well, because also after the last year's elections, there were some initiatives to go beyond the transactional relations and to have some sort of further cooperation and improve the relations between the EU and the Turkey. But we haven't seen anything tangible yet. So I think it's really high time to see some tangible steps coming from the EU if EU is serious about democracy and values.
Thank you, Murat. I think the EU's aspirations to be a geopolitical actor will be tested, actually, in their approach to Turkey in the next few months, because it should be a non-brainer that more engagement and a totally different way of viewing Turkey should be a priority, including vis-a-vis European security. That's like an advertisement for a future EPC event, actually, in a few weeks. So I would like to thank both of you for joining us today. I think that was a very dynamic and interesting conversation. We could have really elaborated on many of these issues actually for hours and hours. At least I certainly could have. It reminded me why I wanted to work on Turkey, because it's such an interesting country, interesting politics. It's a career actually working on Turkey by itself. So thanks to both of you guys. It was great to have you. Thanks for joining us to the audience. This event was part of the EPC's Global Turkey project. We'll be back soon with other events and publications related to Turkey. So please keep checking our website and our Twitter feed. In the meantime, I wish you all a very great evening. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.